Autumn, 1940. The pilot is at 800 feet, hunting the rail yards south of the river. He sees something rising from the ground. Slow. Wrong. The wrong shape for flak. No burst. No flash. Just a thin line drawing itself upward into the dark. By the time he understands what it is, the steel cable is already across his starboard wing. The parachute above pops open. The parachute below pops open. And the bomber stops being a bomber. This is the story of a weapon that hunted in 3 dimensions. A weapon that did not fire shells, did not fire bullets, did not throw flak into the sky. It threw something far more patient than any of those things. It threw a string into the air and waited for a bomber to walk into it. Its name was the parachute and cable. PAC for short. The crews who built it, fired it, and reloaded it called it the Spider. The bombers who flew into it never saw the web. To understand why Britain built such a weapon, you have to go back to the late summer of 1940. London was burning. Coventry was burning. Liverpool, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Hull. The Blitz had begun in September, and the Luftwaffe had learned a lesson the hard way during the daylight battle of Britain. The Spitfires and Hurricanes could not see at night, so the bombers came at night. The British problem was geometric. The standard heavy anti-aircraft guns of 1940 could throw shells up to roughly 20,000 feet, but the proximity fuse did not yet exist in any usable form. The shells had to be timed to burst, and a burst that was a few seconds early or a few seconds late did nothing. Searchlights could pin a bomber for a few seconds. Fighters could be vectored toward the sound of the engines, but the truth, the hard truth that the Air Ministry was sitting on, was that for most of 1940 and into early 1941, the British night defenses shot down almost nothing. The bombers knew it. The bombers came in low when they wanted accuracy and high when they wanted safety. Either way, the gap in the British air defense was enormous. Something had to fill it. Something that did not need to see in the dark. The seed of the idea had already been planted years earlier. At Fort Halstead in Kent, a quiet establishment called the Projectile Development Establishment had been working on solid fuel rockets under a man named Alwyn Crow. The rocket they built was a 3-inch tube of solvent-free cordite, fin-stabilized, no spin, no rifling. It was called the unrotated projectile, and when Winston Churchill came to power in May 1940, he asked for it by the thousand. The first version was a straightforward anti-aircraft rocket. Stand a frame up in a field, load 9 rockets, or 16, or 20, or 128. Fire them all at once. A wall of smoke and flame would climb into the sky and burst at altitude. This was the Z battery, and it was deployed around every major British city by early 1941. The first one ringed Cardiff, the second ringed London, then Crystal Palace, Hyde Park, Sheffield, Liverpool, Hull. But somewhere inside the projectile development establishment, somebody had a darker idea. The rocket motor did not care what was bolted to its nose. The motor would carry an explosive warhead, yes, but it could carry something else just as well. It could carry a parachute, and under the parachute, a length of steel cable. That was the Spider, and what it spun was not a web of flame in the sky, but a web of wire. Here is how the trap worked. The crew on the ground sat behind a small launching frame, a single pack tube. The bomber's engines could be heard low in the dark, before the eye picked it up. Sometimes you heard them before the searchlights had even moved. The crew lit the rocket. The rocket climbed almost vertically, dragging a thin lanyard, then a heavier line, then the cable itself. The motor burned out at roughly 1,000 feet. The forward motion stopped. At the top, a small parachute deployed and held its station, suspended in the night sky like a jellyfish. Below that parachute, 480 feet of steel cable now hung in the column of air, not visible from above, not visible from below, vertical, patient, waiting. When a bomber's wing struck that cable, the impact was almost trivial. The pilot felt a knock. He might have thought a twig had hit the wing if there had been twigs at 1,500 feet. But the cable was not just a cable, it was a trigger. At the bottom of the wire, folded into a small pack, was a second parachute. The shock of the strike pulled the pack open. Now the bomber had one parachute, pulling from above, and another parachute pulling from below, and both of them snagged on his wing. The drag was not enormous, but it was not symmetrical. It pulled the wing down, and it pulled the wing back. In a level flying bomber at low altitude, with a full bomb load, that was enough. The wing dropped. The nose swung. The bomber rolled. The bomber stalled. And then, in the language of pilots, the bomber departed controlled flight. There was no explosion in the air, no fireball, no second of warning, just a sudden uncommanded turn, a sudden uncommanded death. Some crews never knew what had happened. Some crews bailed out and described to their interrogators a feeling that the aircraft had simply refused to fly anymore, as if the sky itself had grabbed them. Back at ground level, the crew was already reloading. The most famous day in the life of the pack was August 18th, 1940. The Luftwaffe later named it the hardest day. Royal Air Force Kenley, the sector station south of London, had been chosen for destruction by bomber Geschwader 76. The plan was a three-stage attack: high-altitude Dorniers first, then dive-bombing Junkers 88s. Then, at 0 feet, 9 Dornier 17s of 9 Staffel, led by Hauptmann Joachim Roth, would come in over the trees and finish the airfield off. The plan came apart in the weather over Calais. The low-level Dorniers arrived first, instead of last. They came in from the south at roughly 100 feet, hugging the ground, the railway line their compass. On the airfield, the crews had been warned by the observer corps. Every Bofors gun was manned, and on the north boundary, a young aircraftman second class named David Roberts was sitting next to a line of 9-pack launchers. When the Dorniers crossed the perimeter, Roberts fired. Above the airfield, 9 rockets climbed almost vertically into the path of 9 bombers. 9 top parachutes deployed. 9 cables hung in the column of air. The lead Dornier, flown by Oberleutnant Rudolf Lamberty, banked hard to avoid the wires. That bank put his port wing directly into the line of fire of the Bofors gunners on the perimeter. A round went through his fuel tank, and the Dornier became a torch. 200 feet behind him, a second Dornier flown by Feldwebel Peterson caught its wing on one of the cables. The top parachute snapped open. The bottom parachute snapped open, and the bomber, still under power, still trying to bomb, was wrenched into an involuntary snap turn. The wing dropped. The aircraft stalled at 100 feet. There is no recovery from 100 feet. The Dornier hit the ground and exploded in a field at the edge of the airfield. Above the airfield, the high-altitude formation was just arriving. Below the airfield, the rocket crew was already reloading. And out by the fence, the wreckage of the Dornier was burning in the grass. The pack had done in 4 seconds what every gun on the airfield had been built to do in 2 years of planning. That was the operational debut of the Spider. But it was not the only place it was set. The Royal Navy had its own version. The pillar box, as it was nicknamed by the men who served around it, was a cabin-shaped launcher mounted on the deck of merchant ships and warships. 10 rocket tubes on each side, 20 altogether, electrically fired by foot pedals. 360 degrees of traverse, elevation from 0 to 85 degrees. The operator could swing it onto a low-flying torpedo bomber and put a wall of vertical cable in the aircraft's path. The Atlantic convoys carried them. The merchant navy carried them. They were the floating spiders, riding the cold grey water. The naval version of the unrotated projectile was a heavier weapon than the airfield pack. The naval rocket carried a small mine of around 8 ounces, suspended on roughly 400 feet of wire under 3 small parachutes. When a low-flying Heinkel 111 came in for a torpedo run on a freighter, the rocket would burst at 1,000 feet, and the mine would drop into the aircraft's flight path. If the wire caught a wing, the mine would be hauled into the wing and detonate. It was not subtle. Both HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales sailed into the hunt for the Bismarck in May 1941, carrying these projectors on their decks. Hood had 5 mounts. Prince of Wales had 80 projectors fitted. Whether they ever fired their rockets in earnest at the Bismarck is another story. What is known is that when the Bismarck's 15-inch shell struck Hood in the Denmark Strait, a fire was already burning in the area where the ready service lockers for the unrotated projectile rockets were stored. Some Royal Navy officers would always quietly believe that the rocket mounts had contributed to the loss of the Hood. The Board of Inquiry rejected the idea, but the unrotated projectile was quietly stripped from capital ships not long after, and the merchant navy continued to be the only place where the Spider went to sea. On land, the Spider went on hunting through 1940 and into 1941. Crystal Palace, Hyde Park, the South Coast, the docks at Liverpool, the docks at Hull. Wherever a Z battery sat, a pack line sat near it. The rockets went up. The cables hung in the dark, and every now and then a German bomber crew would feel that strange, unanswerable tug on a wing, and a Heinkel or a Dornier or a Junkers would simply leave the formation and not be seen again. The bomber crews could not understand it. The Luftwaffe knew about flak. The Luftwaffe knew by late 1940 about the British night fighter. But the Luftwaffe did not have a name for a wire that hung in the sky from a parachute. Captured aircrew described over and over a sudden roll, a sudden drop, no apparent damage. The interrogators wrote it down. Most of the bomber crews who flew into a pack cable did not survive long enough to be interrogated because most of them were flying at 300 feet when their wing was pulled out from under them. That was the killing height. That was the Spider's hunting range. Below 500 feet, the pack was lethal. Between 500 and 1,500 feet, the pack was viable. Above 2,000 feet, the cable was simply not long enough. And that was the Spider's weakness. The German bomber force learned the lesson the way bomber forces always learn lessons, by reading the obituaries. Through the winter of 1940 and into 1941, the Luftwaffe pushed its night raids higher, above the cable, out of reach. The pack could still snare an aircraft on a low approach, but the low approach itself was becoming rarer. The Heinkels and the Dorniers and the Junkers came in at 12,000 feet and dropped their bombs through cloud, and the Spiders below sat with their webs untouched. At the same time, the British were building their second answer to the night bomber, and this one would not need a piece of string. The airborne interception radar fitted into the nose of the Bristol Beaufighter, and later the de Havilland Mosquito gave a night fighter the ability to find, follow, and shoot down a bomber it could not see with the naked eye. By the spring of 1941, the Beaufighters were starting to score. By the autumn of 1941, the Luftwaffe was losing real percentages of its nightly bomber strength to airborne radar and to nothing else. The night sky was no longer dark. The pack had been a weapon for a specific window of British weakness. That window was closing. By early 1942, the manning of the Z batteries and their pack neighbors was largely handed over to the Home Guard. Conventional anti-aircraft gunners had to be under 40 years of age. The pack launchers were so light, the rockets so simple, that a man of 60 could load and fire them. They became a weapon of the part-time soldier, the older man, the village volunteer. They were still being maintained around important targets through 1942 and into 1943. But the bombers were not coming low anymore, and the Spiders were spinning their webs into an empty sky. By the time of the V-1 flying bomb in 1944, the pack was a relic. The flying bombs came in too fast and too straight for a hanging wire to matter. By the end of the war, the launching frames were rusting in fields, and the cables had long since been recovered for scrap. The wire that had hung in the dark above the rail yards of Crystal Palace had been melted down for something else, or simply forgotten where it lay. In a prisoner of war camp in the British Midlands, a former Luftwaffe bomber pilot was interviewed late in the war about a night raid he had flown over the south coast in the autumn of 1940. He had been at 1,200 feet. He had been coming in over the rail yards. He felt, he said in his own quiet way, something across the wing, something gentle, almost soft, and then the aircraft simply turned itself as if a hand had reached out of the dark and laid hold of it. He bailed out. He survived, and he had spent the rest of the war trying to understand what had touched his wing that night. When his interrogator told him it was a cable hanging from a parachute, he laughed. Not a bitter laugh, just the laugh of a man who had been afraid of something he could not name and now had the name for it. It was, he said, a piece of string. He was right. The parachute and cable was the last British weapon to bring down enemy aircraft using a piece of string. It is unlikely that any nation will ever use one again. The age of the Spider is over. But for a few months in the autumn and winter of 1940, when the bombers came in low over the cities of Britain, and the guns could not see them, somebody somewhere, was firing a rocket into the dark, hanging a wire in the sky, and waiting for the night to walk into it.